Well, that was a little weird, but to give you guys a heads up, I am a media partner over with Niche Gamer, and so if you guys are interested, make sure you check out their website, nichegamer.com, or their sister site, Nichiban. But let's go ahead and get into the video that we're going to do for this new thing.
Why are all of these $60 games trying to sell me loot boxes?
Well, to give some history, one of the first known instances to ever have loot boxes in them was the Gachapon ticket that was in the Japanese version of MapleStory, which was an MMORPG back in June of 2004, and those tickets were sold at the price of 100 Japanese yen per ticket. Bigger AAA titles like Overwatch and Middle-earth: Shadow of War have loot boxes implemented into them, and regardless of how you feel about it, loot boxes are gambling, but I think that that's a whole different can of worms to open for later. So we got to get through this first part of the video first, but yeah, this isn't something new. It wasn't something within recent memory. It was 2004.
Why are all these $60 games selling me season passes for their DLC?
LA Noire in 2011 was one of the first video games to feature a season pass, and then Warner Brothers and EA decided that they wanted to go ahead and have their hand at it as well.
Why are all of these $60 games including microtransactions?
In 2006, Bethesda sold horse armor in The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion for $2.50, and it was one of the first experiments into testing DLC being sold on an internet marketplace. I think you see the trend.
Why are all of these $60 games trying to sell me DLC on day one?
Because developers could get away with it. They found that back when they released Mass Effect 3, that if they were going to sell you a $60 game, and then they sold you a $20 DLC on day one, then that sale becomes $80, and they don't have to worry about anything else after the fact. So that's why they do it. It's a really scummy tactic, but it's one that consumers have been buying up ever since it started.
There are many variations, but the fundamental question being asked is the same. Why are they trying to make me pay more than $60 for this game?
The simple answer is because they can. They will try to do their best to get every single dollar out of you for that one-time purchase and the attach rates that go along with it. But, of course, there's a lot of things that go into the prices of why things are so high, like inflation and things of that nature.
Today, we are going to answer that question.
Spoiler alert, he doesn't answer that question, but we might. We might actually do that.
AAA games should not cost $60 anymore.
Well, case closed then. I guess we don't have to really continue on with the rest of this video. Well, thanks for the first video that I made. I appreciate it, guys.
And I'm going to spend the rest of this video explaining why. The price for a AAA game was set at $60 right around the launch of HD consoles, the Xbox 360 and the PS3.
People didn't respond very well to the $50 to the $60 price increase, but we also understood why it had to increase. And that was because game development back then was becoming more difficult, because then you had to develop for the HD consoles like the PS3 and the Xbox 360. Because if you look at any of the PS2 games or the original Xbox games, they look terrible in comparison, so the pay for the $10 upgrade was very much justified. On the other hand though, the price never increased with the Xbox One or the PlayStation 4.
That was around 2005, and the price hasn't shifted again since, but the value of the US dollar certainly has. The rate of inflation over the last decade has averaged out to roughly 2% per year. According to the best figures I can find, that means that the value of goods has inflated 25.34% since we started selling games for $60. And let's just round that down to a flat 25% to keep the math simple.
This part might be a little bit number heavy for a lot of you guys, and it's definitely uncomfortable for me, but nonetheless we have to go over it, so if you want, you can kind of just skip ahead. I won't blame you for this. I went ahead and looked up the numbers to make sure that everything was accurate, and according to this timeline, which you can find at the Inflation Tool website, will tell you how much it actually is. So according to this, $1 that was back in November of 2005 equals about $1.25 in January 2018, which is when this video was made. Now, to add on to this, I went to a website called TechRaptor and found the cost of gaming since the 1970s, which breaks down each console and also the respective average price of video games of that time. One of the first consoles, the Atari 2600, had an average game cost of $39.99 back in 1977, which was fairly cheap or pretty standard at the time for the graphics that you got, but also for a home console. After the video game crash, games were about $45 for the NES, And then moving to the Super Nintendo, games went up to $59.99. However, the average cost of the game in 1995 with the launch of the Sony PlayStation was only $49.99, which gave it a $10 decrease. Nowadays, video game industry insiders don't really want to tell you how bad of an idea it is to have games be beyond $70. They want you to embrace their new overlord pricing, with $69.99 being the new standard. And that was made evident by Matt, and he's the one that made this entire tweet thread about how it would be considered a discount since games had never moved in price since 2005. And don't worry, if you were wondering about Matt Piscatella's wonderful career, he used to be a part of Warner Brothers Games and Activision, two video game companies that helped rein in monetization for the new console generations via microtransactions and loot boxes. Now, the numbers that you do bring up about the cost of inflation, those are correct, but inflation doesn't tell the entire story of how this entire thing started, does it?
So, due to inflation alone, AAA games should be selling for $75 right now.
Well, that's weird that you bring that up, because that means that back in the days, if you bought a PS3 at launch, that $500 now turns into $658, and that's according to the price of inflation. So, by that standard, that means that the PS5 should probably cost you somewhere in the realm of $700 to play your $70 game. You could have inserted something about how inflation isn't the only thing, and you will, but not the thing that you would be thinking about. CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, is defined as the change in the prices of a basket of goods and services that are typically purchased by specific groups of households. PPI, or Producer Price Indices, in manufacturing measure the rate of change in prices of products sold as they leave the producer. They exclude any taxes, transport, and trade margins that the producer may have to pay. All of those factors come into play when talking about the cost of video games, but specifically when we use the formula for CPI, which takes the future value, the present value, the interest rate, or inflation, and the number of times the interest is compounded over the number of months. There may be some other things in there, like the cost of production when making graphics cards, or something like a system on chip that usually consoles have, at least, back then. But since we have to really focus on the number part of this, and we have the rest of the video to talk about it, let's just go ahead and get into the next part.
But obviously, inflation isn't the only factor in play here. AAA games are all competing to have the best-looking game on the market, and that graphical arms race gets way more expensive with each new console generation.
Well, not exactly, because most of the game engines that get used for all of these AAA games have already been made and refined. All they're doing is adding things like ray tracing or more reflections on something that you've already played before. And we could get into that, but again, it's not that expensive, but I'm not saying that it doesn't exist either.
And sure, we have found a lot of clever efficiencies along the way to reduce costs. I mean, heck, we treat third-party game engines like middleware now, and that saves tons. But even with those savings, I would estimate that AAA games cost somewhere between 3 and 4 times as much to make as they did back in 2005.
It's always weird to me that you speak in half-truths, because it's almost like you forget this one important factor called marketing that comes into play. If you look at a list of the top 10 games that had the most total cost in 2019 with inflation, you can see that one of these games is not like the other. Final Fantasy VII from 1997 by Square cost over $127 million with the total cost of inflation. But if you look at these other games, most of them were made in either 2011 or 2004, being like Halo 2. But there's only about 3 games here, and 2 of them are the only ones that are out. Marvel's Avengers was probably due more to licensing because of the Marvel name, and Cyberpunk, well, I don't think we need to get into that. Marketing is usually handled by third-party advertisers where they put links and things like that, ads on your web browser, so that way when you go to certain websites and they know that you play video game, then they will advertise you video game. Or if you look on Twitch or even on television, in newspaper ads, and if you live in LA, virtually everywhere, then you'll see ads for these games, these big AAA titles.
So, does that mean games should actually be costing somewhere between $225 and $300? Fortunately, no. Things aren't quite that dire. It's pretty hard to pin down exact numbers on this, but the game-playing audience is a lot bigger than it was in 2005 too. Like, several times bigger.
which would mean that if there's more people to buy a product, then the price of it shouldn't go up, since people would probably be buying a game at $60 anyways, and if, let's just say, 10 million people bought one game, then that would already cover the cost of everything that they've done and then some. Making a complete game would be a net benefit for them.
And that means that there's a lot more customers to sell to, which helps to make up for that higher production cost, and can result in even bigger profits, if you manage to make a huge hit.
Well, that's not up to the consumer to know what the company is going to do. If the company makes bad game, it's not up to the consumers to just devour the bad game. We vote with our wallets. That's the biggest thing that we can do as consumers.
Unfortunately, when you're counting on that higher number of sales to make a profit, if your game flops, well, you're going to be losing an impossibly large, possibly studio-sinking amount of money.
Yeah, sometimes that just be how it is.
But since we're just focusing on what the average retail price of a game should be, let's just ignore that increased risk factor for now.
No. We should very much be talking about this increased risk factor. Let's look at the things that have went wrong, and especially games that were very expensive to make. Okay, show of hands. Who remembers the game Too Human? Oh, don't worry. I know you guys can't do it because I'm recording a video, but don't worry. I can see your fictitious hands in the audience. Don't worry, because no one else does. Too Human was a game that was stuck in development hell back in the day. It did release back in 2008, but it was one of the worst games that you could probably ever play. Not only was it exclusive to the Xbox 360, but people did like the story when they first heard about it and the class-based system, but everything else as far as the controls or even the frame rate and graphics were pretty terrible. Silicon Knights, the developers of Too Human, as well as X-Men Destiny, they finally went defunct back in 2014, and it was kind of due to more things outside of breach of contract and copyright infringement, but the fact is also that they didn't receive a lot of money from those video game sales as well. We should be bringing up these developers and these video games so that way we don't follow in their footsteps, and so we can also prevent the, trend of bad games coming out.
Based on what we've seen firsthand working in this industry, much of which is under NDA, unfortunately, if I had to make a gut estimate, and understand this really is just a rough guess, I would say that the actual retail price of a modern AAA game without any additional ongoing revenue sources to support it should probably be as high as $85 to $90 new.
And just like that, ladies and gentlemen, we've got to the worst part of the video. Congratulations!
Now, understandably, that number freaks the industry out.
Actually, I think that number freaks out the consumer more than it freaks out the industry, because we've seen time and time again that the industry really does love the attach rates, so instead of having your $60 game be $60, they want to attach a $20 season pass to it. So what they do now is they make it a games as a live service, so that way when you buy it, with no microtransactions, you get a live service game where they drip feed you all the content, which means you still don't get a complete game, but it's also not DLC either.
Who outside of Australia is going to pay $90 for a video game?
Well, obviously, Australia doesn't pay $90 just yet, but even in the case that they did, New Zealand would be the next. So if the price of games goes up from $60 to $90, then you can expect them to pay a little bit more than $100 for those.
I mean, we all saw what happens to the Neo Geo, and this fear has been compounded by the success of the mobile game market, which has sort of trained consumers to think that games should be astonishingly cheap. I mean, for a tablet game, $10 is considered expensive, even if that same game would cost $30 on the DS or $40 on Steam.
Because when you buy them from those preferred platforms like Steam, or if you're buying it somewhere like from the Nintendo eShop, most of those games, for the most part anyways, usually come complete and don't require any more microtransactions, whereas on the $10 mobile game, they're riddled with them, or you would pay more to remove the ads that are currently in them anyways. With $10 being on the App Store, if any of those games were to be delisted, then there's no way to save any of those games, and unless you keep them saved, then that's still not even a guarantee. Whereas on Steam, for the most part, you can back them up onto a disc, or you can save them onto a hard drive of your choice. And then even on the Nintendo eShop, if you have a Nintendo 3DS, they use micro SD cards. With some cases being the mobile-only players of Fortnite, they can't really access the game properly because they won't be updated due to the App Store's restrictions, so spending $10 on a game that you can't play is kind of the point.
For that matter, Steam sales have been training us to expect cheaper games too. And so the industry has kept that $60 price right where it is.
So why do we only bring up Steam sales? Why don't we bring up anything that's on the PlayStation Network store or anything that's on Xbox Live? Because, as you may have guessed, the developers and the publishers are the one that set those prices, not those stores.
And, maybe they're right to do so. A lot of people got pretty bent out of shape when the price got bumped up to $60 back in 2005. And there is something about the number 70 that just feels like, yikes, that's a lot of money.
Oh, poor you in 2018 doesn't know what's going to happen in the year 2020. But don't worry, $70 is right around the corner.
Industry wisdom really may be right here. Maybe raising that standard price any higher than $60 would lead to a drop in sales.
Well, there's where you would be wrong, because NBA 2K21, which is one of the first games to have the $70 price tag, hasn't stopped it from selling, or at least shipping, 8 million copies.
But by not raising prices, we've sort of put ourselves in a tough spot.
It feels like a lot of the people that we cover, they love to say we. It's like they turn French all of a sudden. We aren't doing anything. The industry needs to figure itself out.
If we are going to cover our development costs, reduce the risk of catastrophic losses, and show our shareholders the return percentages they're expecting, we've got to do something to increase revenue.
By making good games?
And we've tried to do that in a lot of different ways, to varying degrees of success. First, we tried increasing revenue by selling DLC, but fans got upset if we sold that DLC at launch, and they didn't buy it if we released the DLC later.
Well, that's because with Mass Effect 3, one of the best examples of Day 1 DLC, the characters were already in the game, and that you can unlock them if you knew how to get into the files if you were on the PC, but then the companies tried to sell it to you for literally $8. The problem with Day 1 DLC is that it's usually cut content that can't be on the game, especially if they're selling it to you. Again, attach rates are a big part of this.
Next, we tried designing games to be perpetual experiences, games that you would play all year long, because then we could sell map packs and expansions over that game's longer lifespan. But supporting those games long-term turned out to be pretty expensive too, and it didn't really work for every kind of game.
That's because people get disinterested in a game whenever it runs on for too long, or they find that the grind might be a little bit too much. That's why some gacha games, after a while, they have a player drop-off. Even for single-player games, once all the content is figured out, then they don't need to play it anymore.
Besides, players can only actively keep up with so many perpetual games at once, so all of those perpetual games have to compete for attention, and the audience just gets locked down. It's like the MMORPG flood all over again.
While there isn't any documentation of the MMORPG flood, just essentially take the word that it's where a lot of MMORPGs first tried to flood into the market. And so they all tried to compete with the likes of World of Warcraft, which was the most popular. Right now, it's pretty much WoW or you play Final Fantasy, but either or, those are the big ones. But that's kind of where we are now. We as consumers can only play so many mobile gacha games with drip-fed events or even some gacha banners, but that's where all of the people's money goes. And so those perpetual games, that's where it leads to.
And so now we are trying the next thing, loot boxes. We'll come back to the specific topic of loot boxes in a couple of weeks, but this is basically where we're at.
No, we can take a good stab at it right now. I mean, we got nothing but time, so let's go ahead and just throw this out here. Loot boxes are gambling, and to say that they aren't is completely disingenuous. The industry loves to have loot boxes put into their games, and sometimes it locks progression. Look into the case of Middle-earth Shadow of War and how they had to remove loot boxes because according to Warner Brothers, small amounts of gold will be given out at specific milestones, perhaps Shadow of War story progression, and also for participating in community challenges. Those loot boxes had to be reworked and taken out of the game because you couldn't progress the story without having to spend real-life money. The last thing that I want to bring up is that every country has their own laws against loot boxes and what they have to do in order to have them regulated. So I'll leave a link to that as well because it's over on Screen Rant and I can't go through every single country, but it is very important.
And now we as an audience have to decide what we want. Are we okay with paying more for these games at retail?
No.
$70? $80? Maybe even more? The data suggests that the answer is no, but if that's the case, well, we're gonna have to learn to live with loot boxes or microtransactions or whatever other model the industry attempts next.
I don't have to live with any of those things. I can go back in the day and play on an emulator for some Sega Saturn games, and I would still get the same level of enjoyment, but probably even more. And according to a very close constituent of mine, a very close family friend, if you will, the best games have already been made.
And by learn to live with, I don't mean put up with predatory crap. I mean we're gonna have to find a way to reward developers for making good supplementary income systems that aren't overly aggressive or in any way required to play competitively.
Whenever a game developer or a publisher decides to put out a game that has any type of microtransactions or monetization in it, then you should always be skeptical of what is going on behind the scenes. So in this particular case of having season passes or something like that, like with Modern Warfare, you have to be very skeptical of how much you're going to spend on it and if it's really worth it. There's a lot of different fallacies that go into gambling and these types of situations with monetization in video games, but we'll leave it here for now.
Monetization systems that leave you satisfied and actually increase your enjoyment of the game you're spending dozens of hours on, even if you choose to spend very little. But make no mistake, those really are our only two options right now. Because like I said at the beginning, AAA games just should not cost $60 anymore.
Yeah, and you never dispelled why they shouldn't cost $60. You've only told us why they should cost more, not less. And if we're looking at this from the consumer standpoint, video games should barely even cost the $60 that they do for a AAA game. Most of the indie games that end up being remembered are usually really good, and they're free. So I don't see what the point is of trying to tell us why spending more on a game is good, actually. But that's all I really have for today, and again, this video is for the Niche Gamer Network, so if you guys are interested, head over to nichegamer.com and also Nichibon, their sister site, for more niche gaming news, anime stuff. But also, thank you to the YouTube members like Pokemon Red and Hey I'm Turtle, as well as the Patreon supporters like Raymond Ortega. But I'll see you guys with another video here very soon. I promise you're gonna love it.